When we talk about avoidance, most people misunderstand what actually drives their attachment system. They assume avoidants are afraid of love, afraid of intimacy, or incapable of deep connection. That's not accurate. Avoidants are not running from love itself, they're running from emotional overload. Their nervous system is calibrated for self-protection, not for chaos. And this is why the first and most important truth you have to understand is this. Avoidants don't choose emotional intensity, they choose emotional safety. Early on, intensity can look like chemistry, passion, obsession, constant communication, high highs and dramatic lows. For many attachment styles, that feels like connection. For an avoidant, it feels like danger. Their body doesn't register intensity as love. It registers it as a threat to autonomy. When emotions come fast, loud, and demanding, the avoidance system goes into shutdown, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system is being flooded. Now, here's the paradox that confuses people. Avoidants can feel intense attraction. They can be deeply drawn to someone. But attraction alone is not what leads them to lifelong bonds. Attraction gets them in the door. Safety is what makes them stay. The partner and avoidant bonds with long-term is not the most emotionally expressive person in the room. It's the person whose presence slows their breathing. It's the person who doesn't escalate every feeling into a crisis. It's the person who can experience emotion without being consumed by it. Emotional safety for an avoidant means I don't lose myself when I'm close to you. Think about it philosophically. At the core, attachment is not about love. It's about regulation. Who calms your nervous system? Who helps you return to baseline? For avoidance, lifelong connection forms with the partner who becomes a safe emotional environment, not an emotional event. This is why avoidants often pull away from people who feel too much too soon. Not because those people are wrong or broken, but because intensity demands immediacy. It demands response. It demands reassurance. And demands, no matter how loving, activate the avoidant's deepest fear, loss of control over their inner world. The partner they commit to doesn't weaponize emotion. They don't collapse when the avoidant needs space. They don't turn distance into drama. They don't interpret every pause as abandonment. Instead, they remain grounded. They feel deeply, but they don't bleed emotionally onto the relationship. And here's where it gets powerful. Emotional safety doesn't mean emotional absence. It means emotional mastery. The avoidance lifelong partner still has needs, still has feelings, still has boundaries, but they express them without pressure, without urgency, without fear driving the message. That changes everything because over time, the avoidance nervous system starts to associate closeness with calm instead of suffocation. Intimacy stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like rest. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The avoidant opens, not because they're forced to, but because their body finally believes it's safe to do so. This is also why avoidants often feel stronger attachment after distance than during intensity. Distance allows regulation. Safety allows return. The partner who understands this doesn't chase the avoidant back into closeness. They create a space worth returning to. And notice how this connects seamlessly to everything else we'll talk about. Emotional safety is the foundation for non-pressure. It's the prerequisite for independence. It's what allows someone to hold space without chasing. You cannot build lifelong attachment with an avoidant if your presence dysregulates them. Avoidants don't fall in love with how much you feel. They fall in love with how safe they feel being near you. And the final truth here is this. The partner who becomes irreplaceable is not the one who tries to prove love through intensity, but the one who proves it through steadiness. Because for an avoidant, the deepest form of love is not being overwhelmed by emotion. It's finally being able to breathe inside it. Once emotional safety is established, the next force that determines whether an avoidant will stay or slowly detach is this: whether they feel accepted as they are or subtly treated as a project. Avoidants don't resist love, they resist correction. And this is where most connections fail before they ever have a chance to become lifelong. From the outside, it often looks like avoidants are emotionally unavailable and therefore need encouragement, guidance, or pressure to open up. But from the inside, the avoidant experiences this as being evaluated, measured, adjusted. And the moment a partner tries to shape who they are, the avoidance nervous system interprets that as a loss of autonomy. Here's the psychological truth most people miss. Avoidance learned early that closeness came with conditions. Love was available, but only if they performed, adapted, or suppressed parts of themselves. So as adults, they're hypersensitive to any signal that says, you're not enough as you are right now. This doesn't require harsh criticism. It can be subtle. Why don't you talk more? I just want you to open up. If you cared, you'd show it differently. These statements may sound loving, but to an avoidant, they translate into one message: you need to change for this to work. And once that message lands, the connection starts eroding. The partner an avoidant bonds with for life does something radically different. They don't rush emotional access. They don't diagnose. They don't interpret silence as a flaw. They allow the avoidant to arrive at intimacy on their own timeline. That doesn't mean passivity. It means respect. Philosophically, this is the difference between love is control and love is recognition. Control says, become who I need you to be. Recognition says, I see who you already are and I choose you anyway. Avoidants commit to recognition, not persuasion. And here's the paradox that changes everything. The more someone stops trying to change an avoidant, the more the avoidant changes on their own. Why? Because growth doesn't happen under pressure. It happens under permission. When an avoidant feels unconditionally accepted, their defenses relax. When there's no emotional gun to their head, curiosity replaces resistance. They begin to explore vulnerability not because they're pushed, but because they resafe. This is also why avoidants often open up after relationships end. Once the pressure is gone, the emotional capacity returns. The tragedy is that many partners never realize it wasn't the avoidant's inability to love that ended the relationship, it was the environment. The lifelong partner intuitively understands this. They communicate needs clearly, but without emotional leverage. They don't make closeness a test. They don't keep score. They don't imply that vulnerability is a debt that must be paid. Instead, they hold a steady posture. I'm here. I value connection and I trust your process. That posture is incredibly disarming to an avoidant because it restores something they rarely experience in relationships: choice. When love feels like a choice instead of an obligation, the avoidant stops protecting themselves from it. Notice how this integrates with emotional safety. Non-judgmental acceptance creates safety. Safety creates regulation. Regulation creates openness. This is the architecture of avoidant attachment, not force, not persuasion, not emotional intensity. And it connects directly to what's coming next. Independence, space, and non-chasing only work when acceptance is real. Otherwise, distance becomes passive-aggressive pressure. True acceptance has no agenda. Avoidants don't commit to the person who tries hardest to change them. They commit to the person who makes change unnecessary. Because the deepest form of intimacy for an avoidant isn't being understood. It's being allowed to be exactly who they are, without fear of losing the connection. Once acceptance replaces pressure, something else becomes essential for the avoidant to form a lifelong bond. Independence, not emotional distance, not detachment, but a partner who stands firmly in their own life. Avoidants don't attach to people who orbit them. They attach to people who have their own gravity. This is where many relationships with avoidance quietly collapse. The moment one partner begins to over-orient their life around the avoidant. Waiting, monitoring, adjusting, shrinking. The avoidant feels the shift instantly, not consciously, not logically, but somatically. Their nervous system reads it as responsibility for another person's emotional stability. And that is the fastest way to trigger withdrawal. Psychologically, avoidants equate closeness with obligation. If you need me to feel okay, I'm no longer free. And freedom to an avoidant is not rebellion, it's safety. It's the assurance that connection will not cost them their identity. The partner an avoidant commits to long-term sends a very different signal. They are emotionally present but self-contained. They enjoy connection, but they don't organize their self-worth around it. They have friendships, goals, routines, and meaning that exist independently of the relationship. This doesn't threaten the avoidant, it relaxes them. Here's the paradox most people miss. Independence doesn't create distance for avoidance, it creates trust. Why? Because an independent partner removes the unspoken fear that intimacy will turn into dependency. The avoidant no longer feels like the sole source of stability, validation, or purpose. And when that weight is gone, closeness becomes lighter, sustainable, inviting. From a philosophical perspective, desire only exists where there is freedom. When someone needs you, they cling. When someone wants you, they choose. Avoidants are exquisitely sensitive to this difference. They are magnetized by choice, not obligation. This is why avoidants often Me deeply attached to partners who seem, on the surface, less emotionally demanding. Not because those partners care less, but because they care without collapsing. They don't make love a transaction. They don't turn connection into a contract. They simply live their lives and allow the relationship to be part of it, not the center of it. And something fascinating happens when an avoidant senses this. Instead of pulling away, they lean in. Instead of guarding autonomy, they share it. Because the relationship no longer feels like a takeover, it feels like a partnership between two whole people. This also explains why avoidants often obsess over partners they couldn't fully anchor, the ones who didn't chase, the ones who didn't wait, the ones who didn't need reassurance to remain steady. Independence creates psychological presence. It leaves an imprint. Now, this doesn't mean emotional unavailability or coldness. Independence is not indifference. It's self-trust. It's knowing you can tolerate distance without panic and closeness without losing yourself. That balance signals emotional maturity, and avoidants respond to maturity far more than to emotion. Notice how this builds naturally from acceptance. You cannot be truly independent if you're secretly trying to earn love, and you cannot offer freedom if you're afraid of losing the relationship. Independence only works when it's real, not performative. This also sets the stage for what's coming next. When a partner is indent, they can hold space without chasing. They can allow silence without interpreting it as rejection. They can remain grounded while the avoidant regulates. Independence is what makes non-pursuit feel safe rather than cold. Avoidants don't attach to people who need them to feel whole. They attach to people who are whole and invite them in, because the greatest gift you can give an avoidant isn't reassurance. It's the freedom to choose you every single day. Once independence is established, the relationship reaches a moment that quietly determines everything, how space is handled. This is where most people lose the avoidant, not because they did something wrong, but because they responded instinctively instead of strategically. Avoidants don't test partners consciously, but they do test them neurologically. And the test is simple. Can you remain emotionally present without pursuing me? Avoidants withdraw not to punish, but to regulate. When intimacy rises, their nervous system seeks distance the way others seek closeness, silence, slower responses, emotional retreat. These are not signals of disinterest. They are self-soothing mechanisms, but what happens next determines whether the bond deepens or fractures. Most partners interpret withdrawal as rejection. They chase clarity. They escalate communication. They demand reassurance. And while this response is human, it has a devastating effect on an avoidance system. Pursuit turns space into pressure. Pressure turns connect into threat. The partner an avoidant bonds with for life does something very rare. They hold space. Holding space is not withdrawal. It's not indifference. It's the ability to remain emotionally open without demanding immediate closeness. It's staying grounded while allowing distance to exist without panic. The avoidant doesn't feel chased, but they also don't feel abandoned. Psychologically, this is profound. The avoidant's deepest fear is not intimacy itself. It's being overwhelmed by another person's emotional urgency. When a partner can tolerate the silence without collapsing into anxiety, something unexpected happens. The avoidance nervous system begins to settle faster. Why? Because the threat disappears. There's no emotional debt accumulating, no unspoken accusation, no pressure weighing on the other side of the silence. The space becomes clean, neutral, safe, and this is where the bond quietly locks in, because the avoidant starts to associate distance with trust instead of danger. They learn, often for the first time, that they can step back and still be held in connection. That realization is deeply corrective. Philosophically, holding space is the opposite of control. It says, I trust your process. And trust is the one thing avoidants rarely experience in intimacy. Most relationships teach them that closeness comes with consequences. Holding space teaches them that closeness can come with freedom. This doesn't mean needs are ignored. The lifelong RTNer still communicates boundaries. They still express desires, but they do it without emotional urgency, without timing demands, without using the avoidance distance as leverage. They don't say, if you cared, you'd come closer. They say, through behavior, I'm here when you're ready. That posture is powerful because it removes the avoidance internal battle. They're no longer choosing between connection and self-preservation. They can have both. And here's the paradox most people never see. The less you chase an avoidant, the more psychologically present you become. Non-pursuit creates presence. Silence, when held calmly, creates impact. The avoidant begins to feel the absence, not as relief, but as awareness. This is why avoidants often reconnect after periods of no contact. Not because they miss being pursued, but because they miss being emotionally held without pressure. The nervous system remembers safety, and notice how seamlessly this fits with everything before it. Emotional safety allows acceptance. Acceptance allows independence. Independence allows space. Space, when held correctly, becomes the doorway to trust. The mistake is thinking holding space means doing nothing. In reality, it requires strength. It requires emotional regulation. It requires confidence in your own worth. Only someone who is grounded can offer space without turning it into withdrawal or manipulation. Avoidants don't stay with the person who chases them into closeness. They stay with the person who makes closeness feel optional, because the moment an avoidant realizes they can leave without losing you is the moment they finally choose to stay. Once space can be held without panic, another shift begins to matter more than anything else: emotional maturity. Avoidants don't bond for life with words, promises, or emotional declarations. They bond through regulation, through consistency, through the quiet, repeated experience of being around someone whose emotional state is stable enough to trust. This is where many people misunderstand avoidance again. They think avoidants want less emotion. That's not true. Avoidants want clean emotion. They want emotion that doesn't spill over, demand, accuse, or destabilize. They want to feel that emotions can exist without becoming weapons. The partner an avoidant commits to permanently doesn't argue emotionally. They don't react impulsively. They don't turn every disagreement into a referendum on the relationship. When something is wrong, they address it clearly. When something hurts, they name it calmly. When something needs to change, they communicate it without threat. This level of emotional maturity does something profound to an avoidant's nervous system. It removes unpredictability. Unpredictability is what avoidants fear most. Emotional spikes, sudden mood shifts, unclear expectations, mixed signals. These force the avoidant into hypervigilance, constantly scanning for danger. And when that happens, intimacy becomes exhausting. But emotional maturity creates pattern, and pattern creates safety. Psychologically, this is co-regulation at its highest level. The mature partner doesn't rely on the avoidant to stabilize them. They regulate themselves first, then engage. This sends a powerful unco. It's just message, you don't have to manage me. And that message is intoxicating to an avoidant, because deep down, avoidants carry a fear that closeness will make them responsible for someone else's emotional world. Emotional maturity removes that burden. It allows the avoidant to relax into connection instead of bracing against it. Notice how different this is from emotional suppression. The mature partner still feels deeply. They just don't outsource their feelings. They don't say, you made me feel this way. They say, this is how I feel and here's what I need. That distinction is everything. Philosophically, this is the difference between emotional adulthood and emotional dependency. One seeks to be understood. The other seeks to be managed. Avoidants choose adulthood every time. This is also why avoidants often stay longer in relationships that look less passionate from the outside. There may be fewer dramatic gestures, fewer emotional highs, fewer intense conversations. But inside the relationship, there is peace. And peace is what allows attachment to deepen rather than fracture. Over time, the avoidant begins to associate this partner with clarity instead of confusion, with steadiness instead of volatility, with self-trust instead of emotional chaos. And once that association is formed, it's incredibly difficult to replace, because emotional maturity creates something rare: reliability without control. The avoidant knows where they stand. They know what expect. They know that conflict won't explode, that space won't be punished, and that closeness won't be demanded. This predictability becomes the emotional home they didn't know they were looking for. And notice how seamlessly this connects to holding space. You cannot hold space without emotional maturity. Without it, silence becomes passive aggression. Distance becomes manipulation. Maturity is what keeps space clean and connection safe. It also prepares the ground for the final point. Only emotionally mature partners can make an avoidant feel chosen rather than cornered. Immaturity clings. Maturity invites. Avoidants don't fall permanently for the person who feels the most. They fall permanently for the person who can handle what they feel. Because when emotional maturity enters the relationship, intimacy stops being a risk and finally becomes a place of rest. When emotional maturity is present, the relationship arrives at its most decisive moment, the point where love either becomes a choice or turns into a cage. This is where avoidants make their final decision, not consciously, not verbally, but internally at the level of identity. Avoidants don't stay because they are convinced. They stay because they feel free. This is the core truth most people never understand. Avoidants don't fear commitment. They fear entrapment. They fear that love will slowly turn into expectation, obligation, and emotional debt. They fear that once they are in, leaving will cost their identity, their peace, or their autonomy. And so the question an avoidant is always asking silently is this: am I choosing this or am I being cornered into it? The partner an avoidant commits to for life never forces an answer. They never rush definitions. They never use time, fear, or ultimatums to secure closeness. They don't say, after everything we've been through, you owe me commitment. They don't turn vulnerability into leverage. Instead, they do something far more powerful. They choose without demanding to be chosen back. This creates a psychological environment that is incredibly rare for an avoidant. Because for the first time, love does not feel like a narrowing of options. It feels like an expansion. There is no threat in staying because there is no punishment for leaving. And paradoxically, this is exactly what makes the avoidant stay. Philosophically, this is the difference between attachment and possession. Possession says, you are mine. Attachment says, I choose you. Avoidance can sense this distinction instantly. Possession activates resistance. Choice activates devotion. The lifelong partner doesn't need guarantees to feel secure. They don't cling to outcomes. They don't build emotional pressure behind expectations. They remain consistent, present, and open, while allowing the avoidant to move freely within the relationship. And that freedom becomes sacred. Because when an avoidant realizes they are not being cornered, something unexpected happens. The internal guard drops. The constant scanning for escape ends. The relationship stops feeling like a contract and starts feeling like alignment. This is also why avoidants often leave relationships where the partner is all in too early. Not because devotion is wrong, but because premature certainty removes choice. When someone's entire emotional future is tied to the avoidant feels responsible for it. And responsibility without freedom creates resentment. The partner who becomes irreplaceable avoids this entirely. They don't say, you complete me. They say, through behavior, I'm complete, and I choose to share my life with you. That distinction preserves freedom on both sides. Psychologically, this restores agency. And agency is the foundation of genuine commitment. You cannot commit authentically if you don't feel free to leave. This is why avoidants often commit suddenly and deeply when the pressure is gone. From the outside, it looks confusing, but internally, the moment makes perfect sense. For the first time, staying feels like a true expression of self, not a sacrifice of it. Notice how everything we've discussed leads here. Emotional safety calms the system. Acceptance removes resistance. Independence preserves identity. Holding space builds trust. Emotional maturity creates reliability. And now, freedom completes the bond. This final piece is what transforms connection into permanence. Avoidants don't stay because you convince them. They stay because no one ever tried to trap them. Because when love feels like a choice instead of a demand, the avoidant doesn't just stay, they commit with their whole being. At the end of all of this, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Avoidants are not broken. They are not incapable of love. They are not emotionally deficient. They are simply wired to protect their inner world at all costs, and they only bond for life with the person who never threatens that protection. They don't stay for intensity. They stay for safety. They don't commit to pressure. They commit to freedom. The lifelong partner is the one who never tries to force closeness, never tries to fix them, never tries to anchor them through fear. Instead, they offer something far rarer: emotional safety without control, connection without obligation, love without captivity. When an avoidant feels accepted as they are, allowed to be independent, given space without punishment, met with emotional maturity, and chosen without being cornered, something extraordinary happens. Their defenses stop being necessary. their nervous system softens, and intimacy no longer feels like a threat to their identity. This is the paradox that changes everything. The moment an avoidant realizes they are free to leave is the moment they no longer want to, because real commitment doesn't come from being held tightly, it comes from being held safely, and when love feels like freedom, even the most avoidant heart learns how to stay.